There's a moment that feels strangely familiar. You're sitting in a meeting, people nod at the right times, smile on cue, and within seconds, you've already mapped the entire rhythm of the room. Not because you're smarter, just because you know which lights will come on, which line will be delivered next. You hear the applause before it begins. You don't feel engaged. Not because you're cynical, but because you're no longer distracted. It's like sitting in a theater after you've learned how the magic trick works. And from that moment on, nothing feels wrong. It just doesn't touch you anymore. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that belongs to people who see too clearly, and it's rarely named for what it really is. Maybe you're not lost. It's just that the things that once guided you don't hold you the way they used to. In a theater, there are people who come to watch. And then there are people who can't just watch. You're sitting there. The lights come on earlier than usual. No announcement. But you see the wires. You can already tell where the next turn will land. You hear the footsteps of someone moving behind the curtain. And then something quiet happens. Everything is still fine. It just doesn't touch you anymore. If you've ever wondered why you don't enjoy things like you used to, listen closely. It's not because you're jaded, not because you're ungrateful, not because you lack feeling. It's simply that the magic no longer holds you. Some people mistake this for arrogance, as if you're standing above everyone else, looking down. But the truth is usually much simpler. You're not standing above. You're just standing under lighting that's too bright. And when the light is too bright, you start watching yourself like someone sitting in the back row, holding an invisible notebook, quietly marking each of their own reactions. Should I be smiling right now? Does my voice sound off? Do I seem cold? Am I making anyone uncomfortable? You don't call this self-awareness. That word sounds too flattering. More honestly, it's a form of self-surveillance, a way of watching yourself as if you're doing quality control on your own performance. And then you get tired. Not tired of the meeting, not tired of people, but tired because you were watching, monitoring, checking, and holding yourself in place all at the same time. Maybe you haven't lost your ability to enjoy things. It's just that what used to distract you no longer works. Let that sentence sit here for a moment. No need to argue with it. No need to prove anything, because this doesn't make you better than anyone else. It just costs you more energy. There may have been stretches of your life where you had to look closely longer than you wanted to. Look in order to understand. Look in order to stay ahead. Look so you wouldn't be caught off guard. And if that's true, then your exhaustion isn't a sign of weakness. It's simply a sign that you've kept the lights on for too long. The problem isn't that you see clearly. The problem is that you almost never get to stop seeing clearly. And that's where we need to step behind the curtain for a moment, because this exhaustion isn't just psychological. There's a very specific biological mechanism running quietly in your brain, even when you appear to be doing nothing at all. Not to expose you, just to help you see why you feel tired, even when nothing seems to be happening. Let's go backstage for a moment to look closely at how that system is actually working. Stay behind the curtain for a moment, not the part meant for the audience, but the place where the light isn't flattering, where metal holds its warmth for a long time, where there's always a faint background hum not loud enough to be called noise, but never truly silent. There's a certain kind of person who doesn't come to the theater to enjoy the show. They come to monitor. If the audience comes to laugh, the backstage technician comes to watch the cables, to check the angle of the lights, to know if something goes wrong, where it will fail first. And if you're someone who sees too clearly, your brain is rarely in the audience seat. It stands backstage, one hand resting on the control panel, eyes fixed on every point where something might break. This needs to be said slowly to clear your name. This brain has grown used to the role of keeping things from falling apart. In easy moments when the performance flows, when the lighting stays steady, when there are no difficult transitions, everything is fine. But when things become more complex, when you have to track, restrain, and keep rhythm at the same time, this brain recruits more. More switches, more checks, more vigilance. In science, this is called over-recruitment. Not because the system is weak, but because it's doing more than usual to keep the show from collapsing. And here's the part that's only fair to say: this exhaustion doesn't come from thinking too much. It comes from never being allowed to leave your post. Like a technician who can't sit down and watch the play all the way through. Not because they don't like it, but because if they look away, no one will be there in time when the lights flicker. That night, the room is dark. Not completely dark. Streetlight slips through a crack in the curtains, drawing a thin golden line across the ceiling. You're lying on your back. Your spine meets the sheets, already cool. No music, just the clock, each tick carving out a very clear pocket of silence. You're not trying to think. You really aren't. And then, like an old tape switching itself on, a sentence appears. Just one. From 3 days ago. The voice returns with its full pitch intact. The pause held a beat longer than usual, the eyes dropping to the table before lifting again. Your forehead warms slightly, not enough to be uncomfortable, just enough to notice. Did I miss a cue? And then the familiar process begins. You rewind the tape the first time. Fast. The person flashes by. The sentence slips past like background scenery. You rewind a second time. Slower, almost frame by frame. You zoom in on the corner of their mouth. That slight lift, was it a real smile or just polite? You rewind a third time. This time, you turn off the image. Only sound remains. You separate their voice from the surrounding noise? The pitch at the end of the sentence, did it rise or fall? Your jaw tightens in the dark. Your teeth touch, just barely. Under the thin blanket, your toes curl slightly, then release. Your body lies still, but your brain is running a marathon at full speed. There's no dramatic emotion, no panic, no sadness, just vigilance. Like standing backstage during a difficult lighting transition. You're not afraid, you just can't afford to look away. The sheet creases under your knees. The air in the room stays still, and inside that stillness, the system keeps running, not because you enjoy digging through the past, but because this system was built to miss no risk. And at some point, a very simple realization appears. This isn't a personality trait. This is a shift. When researchers look at brains like this, they don't see lazy. They don't see weak. They see control regions being recruited more heavily as tasks become harder, like backstage during a complex scene change. More people are needed, more hands, and at the same time, a very old signal switches on in the body: safety vigilance. Not panic or fear, but the sense that if I relax, something could go wrong. That's why you can feel tired even when there's no drama, even when everything is fine. Because for this system, fine has never been a reason to leave the post. Listen to this sentence, very slowly. You're not tired because you think you're tired because you're on duty. And no technician can work continuously without exhaustion. Not because they don't care about the job, but because no one is designed to stay on watch forever. You don't need to prove that you're normal. You don't need to force yourself to relax. Maybe what you're missing isn't more insight. Maybe it's a moment of being off duty even briefly. Before we leave the backstage, there's one more thing that needs to be set in place. This performance was never designed for people who can always see the cables, and that's when we need to step out of the control room and look at the social stage itself. The place where seeing too clearly starts to make you feel like you're standing on the wrong planet. Step out of the control room, not to return to the audience seats, just to see one thing clearly. Why, in the middle of a crowd, do you feel out of sync? In a packed theater, many people come simply to move in rhythm with one another, and that's enough for them. They come to move together, to breathe at the same pace, to laugh at the same moments, to nod at the same time. That's how a crowd creates a very light sense of safety. We're all in the same performance. And this is where you're often misunderstood. You don't hate people. You don't look down on anyone. You're just exhausted because you hear the rehearsal rhythm in what others call natural. On the social level, many conversations aren't about exchanging information. They function more like a warm-up, a sound check, a lighting test. Hey, how have you been? Isn't necessarily a question, it's a signal. A light knock on the door, asking, are you in this performance with me? People call this connection. But sometimes it's closer to synchronization. Not deep. Not wrong, just necessary for a show with many people. The problem is you hear the cue. You hear when people are about to laugh. You hear when the story is about to turn pleasant. You hear when someone is about to tell their story in the exact way they've told it many times before. And because you hear it so clearly, you start to feel like you're standing in the middle of the theater with a backstage headset still turned on. You don't need to judge to see the rigging, you just see it. There's a concept in the world of ideas, a kind of loss of magic. When you look at something long enough, carefully enough, often enough, there comes a point when it's no longer magic. It reveals itself as a structure. Not ugly, just exposed. And when this happens to social life, you begin to see what others don't need to see. Who's leading the rhythm? Who's trying to find their place in the group? Who's using laughter to hold the atmosphere together? Who's speaking so they won't be left behind? You see the mechanisms. And you get tired. Not because you're difficult, but because once you see the mechanism, it's hard to let go. A dinner party. Warm yellow light. Not stage lighting, but living room light. Soft, slightly dim, just enough to make skin look gentler. You're standing by the kitchen counter. A glass of wine in your hand. The cool of the glass rests against your palm. A bead of condensation slides slowly down the stem. A thin line of cold passing over your index finger. Background music plays at just enough. No one is really listening. But it fills the gaps, so silence doesn't become an event. Laughter arrives in layers. One layer over another. Someone laughs loudly, a laugh that clears the way. Someone else laughs along, a laugh meant to stay included. You laugh too, softly. At the right moment, you know exactly where the right moment is. You look around, not to judge. Your eyes simply fall into rhythm. Who's telling the story? Who's holding the group's attention? Who's tossing in a filler line to keep the flow going? Who's nodding a little too much because they don't want to fall out of sync? You notice the small moments too. Someone leaning forward slightly when they want to be heard. Someone touching their glass when they want attention. A glance toward a phone as a quiet exit. And in the middle of all this, you feel something that's hard to explain. Not loneliness, not sadness, but a sense of being on the wrong channel. As if the whole room is listening to music through speakers, and you're hearing an extra layer of sound from behind the curtain. You hear the cues. You hear when a story is about to reach its tender point. When someone is about to lower their voice just enough to create intimacy. When a joke is about to land to release the tension. You don't hate it. You just can't pretend you don't hear it. The wine in your glass slowly warms. The scent rises sweet, with a slight bite. You notice your shoulders are a bit tense. Not much. Just enough to realize you're holding something. There's a moment when you wonder, should I step outside for some air? Then you stay. Still polite, still on beat. But inside, you know one thing very clearly. You're not cold. You're too awake. In a place that requires letting go. And this is where fairness matters. Social life isn't wrong. It simply runs on signals that you read too quickly. Many people need rehearsal. They need familiar lines to get into rhythm. They need laughter as a kind of indicator light. Everything's okay, you're in the right place. And you, once you've seen through that structure, can start to feel like an alien, simply because you no longer believe in the rehearsal rhythm the way you once did. Not because you're unkind, but because you've reached a state where the magic leaves the stage a little earlier. And when the magic leaves, you don't become worse. You just become someone who needs a different kind of connection. Less performance, fewer cues, less smiling on time. Maybe you don't need more connection. Maybe you need connection at your own tempo. But even when you understand that, there's something else, deeper still, a very strange kind of longing. Not for people, but for a time when you could watch without having to stand guard. And that's where we'll go next. There's a kind of longing that's hard to name. Not longing for a person, not longing for a place, but longing for a state before the lights come on. In a theater, there's a moment like that right before the performance begins, when everything is still wrapped in a soft darkness. A darkness that feels like a blanket over your shoulders, a place where you're allowed to be invisible, when the audience isn't required to look yet, not required to follow, just allowed to sit there and wait. You may miss that moment without realizing that you're missing it. Not because you were more naive back then, not because you understood less, but because, at that time, you didn't have to stand guard. You could watch a story without asking yourself what its structure was. You could laugh without hearing the machinery behind it. You could be in a room without scanning every facito predict what came next. It wasn't a big joy, just something very small, release. Then one day, the lights came on earlier than you expected. Not loudly, no dramatic moment. Just from that point on, you began to look. And when you look long enough, you learn how to look closely, how to look correctly, how not to miss anything. You didn't lose that ability. You carried it with you. But there was a very quiet cost. You could no longer return easily to that gentle darkness. You can still sit in the theater. The seat is still comfortable. The air is still warm. But the light no longer lets you forget yourself. Sometimes you feel like you're homesick without knowing where home is. Not a house, not a person, but the feeling of being inside a moment without having to monitor yourself inside that moment. You don't miss the past. You miss the feeling of not having to stay on watch. Maybe that's why, at times, in the middle of a calm evening or a conversation where nothing is wrong, you still sense a very thin absence. Not painful, not loud, just an extremely subtle lack. Like walking into a theater after the show is over, when all the lights are on and you realize you missed the most beautiful darkness. Not because someone took it away, but because it's no longer being held for you. Let this sentence stay here. No need to revise it. No need to do anything with it. You don't want to go back to being naive. You just miss a time when you didn't have to live in continuous inspection mode. And from that very quiet longing, another question begins to form, not about leaving the theater, but about where you're sitting in it. Not to change the performance. Just to see whether there's another way to sit one where you don't have to stand guard for the rest of the play. There's a misunderstanding that lingers for a long time. People assume that once you've seen through the magic trick, you're left with only two options. Either you pretend you don't know anymore, or you leave the theater. But there's a third option, quieter, more grounded. You don't need to leave the theater, you just need to change roles. Because what exhausts you isn't the act of watching. It's how you're watching. Here's a way of watching that resembles supervision. You're sitting there, but in your mind, there's a clipboard. You hear audio flaws others miss. You notice the lighting off by half a beat that no one else reacts to. You anticipate the scene change before it happens, and your body tightens as if it's your responsibility to catch the fault. That's watching to critique, not necessarily because you want to judge. Sometimes simply because you're used to it. Sometimes because you've lived too long in the role of the person who has to read the situation correctly. You're not only watching the performance, you're watching your own reaction to it. Am I feeling the right thing? Should I be moved here? Am I being numb? Am I being too demanding? You're both the audience and the one grading the audience. And that's a kind of exhaustion that doesn't end. But there's another way of watching, not less intelligent, not less perceptive, just less monitoring. In the theater, a witness is someone who still sits there, still sees the cables, but no longer holds them. A witness doesn't rush onto the stage to fix the lighting, doesn't jump into the scene to adjust the dialogue, doesn't ask whether they're feeling the right thing. A witness simply witnesses, letting things pass, letting themselves pass along with them. That's watching to witness. And the most important point, it doesn't require you to believe in the magic again. You don't need to fool yourself. You don't need to return to innocence. You just need to stop being the supervisor. You don't need to believe in the magic to rest. Perhaps what truly changes is the moment you step out of the supervisory role. If you're someone who's fluent in logic, this will make immediate sense. Exhaustion doesn't always come from too much to do. It often comes from too much checking. When you're watching, auditing, grading, monitoring, you're placing two performances on yourself at once. One on the stage, and one inside your head. What you need isn't less understanding. It's reducing the inspection load so there's room for experience load. Not to make emotions bigger, just to let them have a chance to appear without being examined immediately. You might imagine a very small moment. You sit down, your back meets the chair, your shoulders release even just a little. You still hear the machinery, but you don't move toward it. You still see the cables, but you don't reach out to check. You still know the scene change is coming, but you let it come. And in that exact moment, the magic may not return. That's okay. What returns instead is a deeper breath. A small pocket of space given back to you. Not less understanding, just less monitoring. And when you stop being the supervisor, you realize something very quietly. You don't need to escape life. You just need a seat within it where you don't have to stand guard all the time. The theater slowly empties. There's no closing music, no applause of thanks, just rows of seats still holding warmth and the lights dimming, little by little. You don't rush to stand, not because you don't know where to go, just this time. You don't need to respond right away. In this moment, there's nothing more to understand, nothing to fix, no role left to hold. You've spent long enough in the role of the one on watch, and the reason you're still here isn't to learn something new, but to confirm something very small. Oh, I saw it, and I don't need to do anything with it. If, throughout this video, you didn't nod much, didn't have an aha moment, didn't feel convinced, but instead felt a very quiet sense that someone was speaking right to the seat you're sitting in, then maybe you found the right theater. You don't need to leave a trace, no need to prove you were here, no need to say anything more. But if this feeling feels familiar, the fact that you stayed is already an answer. Staying in a very quiet way. By returning when you need a space that doesn't ask you to perform better, understand more deeply, or become someone else. Not because this channel is helpful, but because it doesn't pull you anywhere. Here, you're allowed to sit still with what you've already seen, without turning it into action. The lights are almost fully out, and if you stand up now, that's okay. If you sit a little longer, that's okay too. Here, you don't need to respond to anything else.